All right, so today we're going to talk a little bit about common denominators. Those are also called like fractions. But just to make sure we're all clear on what a common denominator is, let's say it's something like 4/9 and 1/3. Those are different denominators. Again, the denominator is the number on the bottom of a fraction. The number on the top is called a numerator. But in this case, you can see these are not common denominators. They are also called unlike fractions because they are different numbers for our denominators. So sometimes in math problems, you want to make common denominators. And so you'll go through the process of turning two fractions so they both have common denominators. But let's just say, for our example, we've got two fractions here. Now we can see these have common denominators. So why would you want common denominators? Well, first off, it makes it really easy to compare. So if you're having to find out less than or greater than, if they have the same common denominator, you can just see which has a bigger numerator, and that tells you which is the bigger fraction. Also, let's say, for example, you are adding or subtracting fractions, you have to have common denominators when you do that. Have those, so you could then add those, and you get 9/9. Okay, so that's why we need them. So then let's look at a couple ways that you could make them. So our first example right here, we'll call this the quick way. This is usually the first way people learn how to do it. And the steps, there's kind of just one main step. We're going to make equivalent fractions by multiplying each fraction's numerator and denominator by the other fraction's denominator. Let's say we had a fraction. We have two fractions, like we had 3/4 and 5/6. Now these do not have common denominators. So if I wanted to make common denominators, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the denominator of each one. And so for example, in our first fraction, we have 3/4 and the denominator on the other fraction is 6. So we're going to make an equivalent fraction by multiplying both the numerator and the denominator by that 6. 3 times 6 gives us 18. 4 times 6 gives us 24. So 18/24, that is equivalent or equal to 3/4. We're going to take 5/6 and we're going to multiply those by the denominator of the first fraction. So 5 times 4 gives us 20. 6 times 4 gives us 24. Now we can see we have common denominators. So 18/24 is equal or equivalent to 3/4. 5/6 is equivalent to 20/24. We can now see that 5/6 is bigger, or 20/24 is bigger. We could add them, we could subtract, we could do all that kind of stuff. That's how we're making common denominators. So that was example A. Look at one more example of this. Let's say I had something like 3/8 and let's say 1/4. And you had to make common denominators. So you could, again, you're going to look at the other fraction's denominator. So our second fraction's denominator is 4. So we'd be multiplying both of these by 4. And that would give us 12/32. And then we would multiply both of these by 8. So that would give us 8/32. So now we've made equivalent fractions with common denominators. Okay, but one thing you might notice is that we're starting to get some rather large numbers. And so that's why this way will work. But there's another way, I'm going to call it the better way, that is also known as the least common denominator. And so that means you're going to find the denominator that's going to be small. Okay, so we've got some steps here. You can see we've got a couple more steps. This is how we find the least common denominator, or that's the smallest common denominator. So to see what I mean by that, I'm going to use the same fractions I used for my other examples. So for example A, we'll do 3/4 and 5/6. So if I want to find the least common denominator, what I'm going to do, it says step 1, identify or list multiples for each fraction's denominator. So again, multiples is kind of like you're counting by that number. So 4 times 1 is 4, 4 times 2 is 8, 4 times 3 is 12, 4 times 4 is 16. I'm just listing the multiples. I'm going to do that for 6 as well for a little bit. 6, 12, 18, 24. And then it says step 2, stop when you find a multiple they both have in common. So if we look right here, we will see that they both have a 12 in common. That is the first multiple they have in common. So we're actually going to use 12 as our common denominator. So that would mean, so step 3, make equivalent fractions for each fraction with the common multiple as the denominator, So we're going to make 12 the denominator, so we'd do 4 times 3, and 3 times 3, again, you're going to multiply by the same thing, so your fraction is equivalent. That would give us 9/12. And then we're going to turn 6 into 12, so we're going to have to multiply by 2, and then that would give us 10/12. So we have 9/12 and 10/12. Now, you will notice, right, these 9/12 and 10/12 and 18/24, we started with the same fractions and we found common denominators, but the common denominators in our second one are actually smaller. Those are the smallest common denominators they have. Now, the advantage of choosing smaller common denominators is just you have smaller numbers to work with. It's not going to get as big with your multiplication. You'll probably have less simplifying at the end of the problem. So I always recommend find the least common denominator if you can. You'll see I'm listing out all the multiples, but if you know your times tables, these will be pretty quick. You can kind of just do that part in your head. So let's look at our example B. We had 3/8 and 1/4. So we can think, okay, we're going to list our multiples for 8. 8 is 8, 16. If I start listing my multiples for 4, I would see 4, 8. Oh, I already see a common denominator. That 8 is what we're going to make. So I don't even have to multiply the first fraction by anything. If I want, I could put times 1. But that's going to stay as 3/8. And then 1/4, we're going to multiply those by 2. And then that gives us 2/8 as our other fraction. So again, we've made common denominators. And you can see the first time when we did that, right, we had 12 30-seconds and 8 30-seconds. Whereas we could have just had 3/8 and 2/8, right? So again, the least common denominator is just going to give you smaller numbers to work with. I'll give you one final example. Let's say I had something big like, see here we have 13/20 and 19/30. So this is where it really starts to be helpful to use the least common denominator. I could multiply, if I was using the quick way, that means I'd be multiplying like this by 30 and this by 30, and I'm going to get some really big numbers there. Whereas instead, if I think, well, what's the least common denominator, I could think about my multiples, 20, 40, 60. For 30, I would have 30, 60. Oh, I already got one right there. All right, so I'm going to turn my new common number is going to be 60. So I have to do times 3 times 3 and times 2 times 2, which would give me 39/60 and 38/60. Again, then I could compare them, find which one's greater. I could add or subtract them. But again, finding the least common denominator is definitely going to be a faster and smaller common denominator that will work. Now they're both, again, both of these ways will work. Both of them will give you a common denominator, but the least common denominator I recommend using. Good luck.